Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight I'd like to tell you about a case that shocked Dallas in 2015. This is the story of Dr. Kendra Hatcher, a beloved pediatric dentist whose life was cut tragically short by jealousy and obsession. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gleaming towers of Dallas's Uptown district on September 2nd, 2015. In one of those towers, Gables Park 17, a luxury high-rise apartment building, 35-year-old Dr. Kendra Hatcher was beginning what would unknowingly be her final day. Kendra was everything you'd expect from a successful professional living in one of Dallas's most prestigious neighborhoods. Standing at average height with warm brown hair and an infectious smile, she had built a thriving practice as a pediatric dentist. Children adored her gentle manner, and parents trusted her completely with their little ones' dental care. She had that rare combination of professional competence and genuine warmth that made her patients feel at ease the moment they walked into her office. But Kendra wasn't just successful professionally. She embodied the American dream in many ways. Originally from a small town, she had worked tirelessly through dental school, establishing herself in one of Texas's most competitive markets. Her uptown apartment was a testament to her hard work. Spacious unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline, tastefully decorated and impeccably maintained. Those who knew Kendra described her as kind, generous, and genuinely caring. She wasn't the type to flaunt her success or look down on others. Instead, she used her position to help whenever she could, often providing dental care at reduced rates for families who couldn't afford it. Her colleagues respected her, her patients loved her, and her friends cherished her loyalty and humor. In the months leading up to that September morning, Kendra had been particularly happy. She had recently begun dating Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, a fellow medical professional who went by Ricky. Their relationship was still relatively new, but promising. They shared similar backgrounds, understood the demands of medical careers, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Ricky was planning something special for Kendra, a vacation to Mexico that they had been discussing for weeks. It was to be their first trip together, a chance to escape the pressures of their demanding careers and spend quality time getting to know each other better. Kendra was excited about the trip, telling friends about their plans and looking forward to experiencing a new place with someone she was growing quite fond of. What Kendra didn't know as she went about her morning routine that September day was that her budding relationship with Ricky had placed her directly in the crosshairs of someone consumed by jealousy and rage. Someone who had been watching her every move, learning her routines, and meticulously planning her destruction. As Kendra prepared for work that morning, selecting her professional attire and gathering her things, she had no idea that miles away, a plot months in the making was about to reach its horrific conclusion. She couldn't have imagined that her simple act of dating a good man would trigger such a violent response from someone she had never even met. The irony was heartbreaking. Here was a woman who dedicated her life to healing and helping others, particularly children, yet she had unknowingly become the target of someone who saw her very existence as a threat that needed to be eliminated. To understand what happened to Kendra Hatcher, we must first understand Brenda Delgado. 33 years old at the time of the murder, Brenda presented herself as a successful, independent woman. She was attractive, well-dressed, and articulate, the kind of person who could easily blend into Dallas's professional social scene. But beneath this polished exterior lurked something much darker. Brenda had been in a relationship with Dr. Ricardo Paniagua for several years. To those on the outside, they seemed like a successful couple, two professionals building a life together in one of Texas's most vibrant cities. However, the reality was far more complicated. Their relationship had been troubled for some time. Friends and family members would later describe a pattern of behavior from Brenda that was concerning. She was possessive, jealous, and had difficulty accepting that her relationship with Ricky was ending. When Ricky finally made the decision to break up with her, Brenda's reaction was not one of sadness or disappointment, but of rage and disbelief. For Brenda, the breakup wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was a personal attack on everything she believed she deserved. In her mind, she and Ricky belonged together, and anyone who came between them was an interloper who needed to be dealt with. This wasn't the normal heartbreak that comes with the end of a relationship. This was something much more dangerous. As weeks turned into months after the breakup, Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic. Instead of moving on, she began what can only be described as a campaign of surveillance against her ex-boyfriend. She tracked his movements, monitored his social media, and even went so far as to track his cell phone location. This wasn't casual checking up. This was obsessive, methodical stalking. When Brenda discovered that Ricky was dating someone new, her obsession reached a new level. The woman's name was Dr. Kendra Hatcher, and from Brenda's perspective, she represented everything that was wrong with the situation. Here was this other woman, living what Brenda believes should be her life, dating the man she still considered to be rightfully hers. Brenda began researching Kendra extensively. She learned about her profession, her home address, her daily routines, and her habits. She discovered that Kendra lived in the luxury Gables Park 17 apartment complex in uptown Dallas. She learned about Kendra's dental practice and even found out details about her personal life that should have been private. This wasn't idle curiosity, this was intelligence gathering. Brenda was methodically collecting information about her target, though at this point even she might not have fully realized what she was planning to do with it. The obsession was consuming her, driving her to spend countless hours focused on this woman she had never met but had come to see as her enemy. The breaking point came when Brenda learned about the upcoming Mexico vacation. Through her surveillance of Ricky's phone and activities, she discovered that he was planning a romantic getaway with Kendra. To Brenda, this represented a line being crossed. It wasn't just dating anymore, this was Ricky building a serious relationship with another woman, creating memories and experiences that in Brenda's twisted logic should have been hers. It was at this point that Brenda's obsession transformed from surveillance into something far more sinister. She began to formulate a plan, not to win Ricky back, but to eliminate the obstacle that stood in her way. In her mind, if Kendra Hatcher was gone, the path back to Ricky would be clear. Brenda Delgado was not the type of person who could commit murder with her own hands. Despite her rage and obsession, she needed others to carry out her deadly plan. This led her into the darker corners of Dallas society, where she began to recruit accomplices who would be willing to kill for money and drugs. The first person she approached was Crystal Krug, a 23-year-old woman who was struggling with her own set of problems. Crystal was a young mother trying to make ends meet, and she had a history of making poor decisions when it came to quick money. She was exactly the type of person Brenda was looking for, someone who needed money badly enough to ask few questions about where it was coming from. Brenda presented the plan to Crystal carefully. She didn't immediately reveal that she wanted someone murdered. Instead, she talked about wanting to get rid of Kendra Hatcher, using language that was deliberately vague but carried clear implications. She offered Crystal $500, a significant sum for someone in Crystal's financial position, to serve as a getaway driver for what she described as a robbery. The story Brenda told was carefully constructed. She claimed that Kendra was wealthy and would be carrying expensive jewelry and cash. All Crystal had to do was drive the getaway car while someone else did the robbing. It was presented as a simple theft, not a murder, though Crystal would later admit that she suspected the true nature of the plan from the beginning. To carry out the actual killing, Brenda recruited Christopher Love, a 31-year-old man with an extensive criminal history. Love was not new to violence. He had been arrested multiple times for various offenses, including violent crimes. He was exactly the kind of person who could and would kill someone for the right price. Brenda's offer to Love was straightforward: money and drugs in exchange for shooting Kendra Hatcher. Love agreed without hesitation. For him, this was just another criminal enterprise, another way to make quick money. He showed no concern for the victim or the reasons behind the contract. To him, Kendra was simply a target, not a human being with a life, dreams, and people who loved her. The plan they developed was methodical and cold-blooded. They would follow Kendra to learn her routines and identify the best time and place to strike. They would make it look like a robbery gone wrong, taking her purse and jewelry to provide a motive that would throw off investigators. Crystal would serve as the lookout and getaway driver, positioning herself to help Love escape quickly after the shooting. Over the course of several weeks, this unlikely trio began their surveillance operation. They followed Kendra to work, to restaurants, to social events, and back to her apartment. They learned her schedule, identified her car, and mapped out the layout of her apartment complex's parking garage. They were like predators stalking their prey, learning every detail that would help them carry out their deadly mission. What makes this conspiracy particularly chilling is how normal these planning sessions must have seemed to the participants. They weren't meeting in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They were meeting in restaurants, in cars, in everyday locations where ordinary people conduct ordinary business. Evil, it seems, can be planned over coffee and discussed in casual conversation. Brenda was the mastermind, providing the motivation, the money, and the information. She had become so consumed with her hatred of Kendra that she was willing to pay for murder rather than simply accept that her relationship with Ricky was over. Crystal was the facilitator, providing the transportation and serving as the link between Brenda and Love. And Love was the weapon, the person willing to pull the trigger for money and drugs. September 2nd, 2015, began like any other Wednesday for Dr. Kendra Hatcher. She awoke in her luxury apartment, prepared for her workday, and headed out to see patients at her dental practice. She had no idea that miles away 3 people were making final preparations for her murder. Brenda Delgado's surveillance had provided her conspirators with detailed information about Kendra's routines. They knew she typically returned home from work in the early evening, parking her car in the underground garage of Gables Park 7. The garage was perfect for their purposes. Relatively secluded with limited visibility from the street and few witnesses likely to be present during the dinner hour. As Kendra went about her day, treating young patients and managing the administrative tasks that came with running a successful dental practice, Love and Cortez were positioning themselves for the attack. They had stolen a black Jeep Cherokee to use as their getaway vehicle, ensuring that the crime couldn't be traced back to them through vehicle registration records. The plan was simple but effective. Love would hide in the parking garage, waiting for Kendra to arrive. When she parked her car and began walking toward the elevator, he would approach her, demand her purse and jewelry to make it look like a robbery, and then shoot her. Crystal would be waiting in the Jeep, ready to speed away the moment Love returned to the vehicle. What they hadn't counted on was how long Kendra would be at work that day. As evening approached, they found themselves waiting longer than anticipated. This extended wait must have been nerve-wracking for Crystal, who was sitting in a stolen vehicle in broad daylight, knowing that at any moment she would become an accessory to murder. Meanwhile, Brenda Delgado was establishing her alibi. She positioned herself at a restaurant where she could be seen by multiple witnesses, making sure that when questioned later, she would have proof that she was nowhere near the scene of the crime. She even made phone calls during the time period when the murder was planned, creating a digital trail that would supposedly prove her innocence. Around 7:30 that evening, Kendra finally left her dental office and began the drive home to her uptown apartment. She was probably thinking about dinner plans, maybe looking forward to relaxing after a long day of work, possibly even thinking about her upcoming vacation with Ricky. She couldn't have imagined that killers were waiting for her. As Kendra drove through Dallas traffic toward her apartment building, Love was making his way into the Gables Park 17 parking garage. The building's security was good, but not perfect. Like many urban apartment complexes, it was designed to keep out casual intruders, not determined criminals who had spent weeks studying its vulnerabilities. When Kendra arrived at her apartment building, everything must have seemed perfectly normal. She pulled into her usual parking space in the underground garage, turned off her engine, and gathered her things from the passenger seat. She was probably thinking about what to have for dinner, maybe planning to call Ricky to finalize some details about their upcoming trip. What happened next was swift and brutal. As Kendra stepped out of her car and began walking toward the elevator, Love appeared from his hiding place. According to Crystal Cortez's later testimony, the encounter was brief. Love approached Kendra, demanded her purse, and when she complied, he shot her in the back of the head. The murder was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a cold-blooded execution. Love took Kendra's purse and some jewelry as planned to make it look like a robbery, but the single shot to the back of the head revealed the true nature of the crime. This wasn't someone panicking during a theft. This was someone carrying out an assassination. After shooting Kendra Hatcher, Christopher Love quickly rifled through her belongings, taking her purse and jewelry as planned to maintain the fiction that this was a robbery. But his primary concern wasn't theft. It was escape. He hurried back to where Crystal Cortez was waiting in the stolen Jeep Cherokee, and they sped away from the scene. The murder had taken only minutes, but those few minutes had shattered countless lives. Kendra lay dying in the parking garage of her own apartment building, in a place where she should have been safe. The woman who had dedicated her career to healing children would never see another patient, never take another vacation, never experience the life she had worked so hard to build. Crystal Cortez later testified that after picking up Love, she drove him back to his apartment and then went to collect her young son, who had been staying with her grandmother during the murder. The casual nature of this detail is particularly chilling. After participating in a brutal murder, she simply returned to her normal routine as a mother, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Cortez wasn't done with her criminal activities for the evening. After collecting her son, she drove to meet Brenda Delgado to collect her payment. Brenda gave her $500 in cash for her role as the getaway driver. Blood money paid for helping to end an innocent woman's life. In what would later become a crucial piece of evidence, Crystal Cortez took a selfie with the money she had been paid for participating in the murder. This photograph would eventually be found by investigators and would serve as damning evidence of the conspiracy. The image showed Cortez smiling and holding up the cash, seemingly proud of what she had just accomplished. Meanwhile, back at Gables Park 17, Kendra's body had been discovered by other residents of the building. The police and paramedics arrived to find a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Here was a successful professional woman, shot to death in the parking garage of a luxury apartment building, apparently during a robbery. The initial investigation focused on the robbery angle. Kendra's purse was missing, along with some jewelry, which suggested that this might have been a random crime. A woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by criminals who saw her as an easy mark for theft. But experienced investigators know that things are not always what they seem. The location of the shooting in a secured parking garage of an upscale building was unusual for a random robbery. The single shot to the back of the head was more consistent with an execution than with a panic thief, and Kendra herself didn't fit the profile of someone who would be randomly targeted for robbery. As detectives began interviewing Kendra's friends, family, and colleagues, they learned about her relationship with Dr. Ricardo Paniagua. They also learned about Ricky's previous relationship with Brenda Delgado, and about Brenda's difficulty accepting that the relationship was over. The investigation began to shift focus from a random robbery to something much more personal and sinister. Detectives started looking into Brenda Delgado's whereabouts and activities, and what they found was deeply suspicious. Through phone records and surveillance footage, investigators were able to track the movements of the stolen Jeep Cherokee used in the murder. They also discovered that Brenda had been tracking Ricky's cell phone, giving her detailed information about his movements, and by extension his relationship with Kendra. The Dallas Police Department's investigation into Kendra Hatcher's murder was methodical and thorough. Detectives knew from the beginning that this wasn't a typical robbery gone wrong, despite the missing purse and jewelry. The execution-style shooting in a secured parking garage suggested something much more personal. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators were able to track down the stolen Jeep Cherokee used as the getaway vehicle. Through surveillance cameras and witness statements, they identified Crystal Cortez as the driver of the vehicle on the night of the murder. When confronted with this evidence, Cortez initially tried to maintain her innocence, but she eventually broke under questioning. Crystal Cortez became the weak link in the conspiracy. Unlike Brenda Delgado, who was calculating and manipulative, or Christopher Love, who was experienced in dealing with law enforcement, Cortez was young, frightened, and unprepared for the reality of being investigated for murder. When faced with the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison, she began to cooperate with investigators. Cortez's confession was detailed and damning. She admitted to serving as the getaway driver and implicated both Brenda Delgado as the mastermind and Christopher Love as the shooter. She described how Brenda had recruited her, how the plan had been developed over several weeks, and how they had stalked Kendra to learn her routines. Perhaps most importantly, Cortez led investigators to the selfie she had taken with the money she was paid for her participation in the murder. This photograph provided concrete evidence of the financial motivation behind the crime and helped establish the premeditated nature of the conspiracy. With Cortez's cooperation, investigators were able to build cases against both Delgado and Love. They obtained search warrants for Delgado's home and electronic devices, uncovering evidence of her obsessive surveillance of her ex-boyfriend and her extensive research into Kendra Hatcher's life. The evidence against Brenda Delgado was overwhelming. Phone records showed that she had called Crystal Cortez at the exact time the murder was committed. GPS data revealed that she had been tracking Ricky's movements for months. Internet searches on her devices showed that she had researched Kendra extensively, learning details about her home, her work, and her personal life. Christopher Love was identified through Cortez's testimony and through physical evidence found at the scene. His criminal history made him a perfect candidate for this type of violent crime, and the evidence suggested that he had carried out the murder without hesitation or remorse. However, building a case and making arrests are two different things. While Crystal Cortez was quickly taken into custody and charged, both Delgado and Love initially evaded capture. Christopher Love was eventually arrested and charged with capital murder. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence that he had shot Kendra Hatcher in cold blood for money and drugs provided by Brenda Delgado. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death for his role in the murder. But Brenda Delgado proved more elusive. Sensing that investigators were closing in on her, she fled the country, crossing the border into Mexico before she could be arrested. This began a years-long international manhunt that would test the resolve of both American and Mexican law enforcement. Brenda Delgado's flight to Mexico was not a spontaneous decision born of panic. It was a calculated move by someone who had been planning for the possibility of capture from the beginning. She had family connections in Mexico and understood that extradition proceedings could be complicated and time-consuming, potentially giving her years of freedom even if she was eventually caught. Her escape added another layer of complexity to an already intricate case. While Christopher Love and Crystal Cortez were in custody and facing trial, the mastermind behind the murder was living freely in another country, protected by international law and the complexities of extradition treaties. For Brenda's victims, not just Kendra's family and friends, but also Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, who had to live with the knowledge that his ex-girlfriend had murdered his new love. This was a particularly painful development. The woman who had orchestrated such a heinous crime was beyond the reach of American justice, at least temporarily. The FBI quickly added Brenda Delgado to their 10 most wanted fugitives list, making her one of only the 9th woman in the history of that list. This designation brought additional resources to the manhunt and increased international attention to the case. It also meant that a substantial reward was offered for information leading to her capture. Mexican authorities were cooperative in the search, but finding one person in a country of over 125 million people is no simple task. Delgado had the advantage of speaking fluent Spanish, understanding Mexican culture, and having family support that could help her blend in and avoid detection. During her time as a fugitive, Brenda Delgado managed to stay hidden for several years. She likely changed her appearance, avoided areas where she might be recognized, and relied on a network of supporters who were willing to help her evade capture. The FBI and Mexican authorities followed numerous leads, but Delgado always seemed to be one step ahead. Meanwhile, in Dallas, the trials of her co-conspirators were moving forward. Christopher Love was convicted and sentenced to death, while Crystal Cortez accepted a plea bargain that gave her 35 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against the others. Both trials kept the case in the public eye and maintained pressure on law enforcement to find Delgado. The breakthrough in the international manhunt came in 2018, when Mexican authorities finally tracked down Brenda Delgado and arrested her. The arrest was the result of years of patient investigative work, following financial records, communication patterns, and tips from the public. However, Delgado's arrest was only the beginning of another complex legal process. Mexico has strict laws about extraditing suspects who might face the death penalty, requiring assurances from the United States that capital punishment would not be sought. This meant that prosecutors in Dallas had to agree that Brenda Delgado would not face execution if convicted, even though she was clearly the mastermind behind the murder. The extradition process took additional months, during which Delgado remained in Mexican custody, while lawyers on both sides of the border worked through the legal requirements. Finally, in 2019, she was transported back to Dallas to face trial for her role in orchestrating Kendra Hatcher's murder. When Brenda Delgado finally returned to Dallas to face trial in 2019, nearly 4 years had passed since Kendra Hatcher's murder. The case had evolved from a local crime story into an international saga involving fugitive hunters, diplomatic negotiations, and complex legal maneuvering. The prosecution team had spent those years preparing for this moment. They had Crystal Cortez as their star witness, ready to testify about Delgado's role in planning and orchestrating the murder. They had phone records, financial evidence, and digital forensics that painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and willing to pay for murder rather than accept the end of her relationship. Delgado's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and her flight to Mexico had only made her appear more guilty in the eyes of potential jurors. Their strategy focused on attacking the credibility of Crystal Cortez, arguing that she was a liar who had planned the robbery herself and was now trying to blame Delgado to reduce her own sentence. But this strategy had significant weaknesses. The phone records showing Delgado calling Cortez at the exact time of the murder were impossible to explain away. The evidence of Delgado's obsessive surveillance of her ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend created a clear motive for the crime, and the fact that she had fled the country rather than cooperating with investigators suggested consciousness of guilt. The trial was emotionally charged, with Kendra's family members present to see justice finally served for their loved one. They had waited nearly 4 years for this moment, enduring the pain of knowing that the person who had orchestrated Kendra's murder was living freely while their daughter's sister and friend was gone forever. Crystal Cortez's testimony was devastating for Delgado's defense. Speaking calmly and matter-of-factly, she described how Delgado had recruited her for what she initially thought was a robbery, how the plan had evolved over several weeks, and how she had been paid $500 for her role as the getaway driver. Cortez admitted her own guilt and expressed remorse for her role in Kendra's death. But she was also clear about Brenda Delgado's central role in planning and financing the murder. She testified that Delgado had said she wanted to get rid of Kendra Hatcher, language that left little doubt about her intentions. The prosecution also presented evidence of Delgado's extensive surveillance activities. Phone records showed that she had been tracking her ex-boyfriend's movements for months, giving her detailed information about his relationship with Kendra. Internet searches on her devices revealed that she had researched Kendra extensively, learning about her home address, her work schedule, and her personal life. Perhaps most damaging was the evidence showing that Delgado had called Crystal Cortez from a restaurant at the exact time Kendra was being murdered. This phone call, made while Delgado was establishing her alibi by being seen in public, demonstrated the coordinated nature of the conspiracy and her direct involvement in timing the attack. The defense's attempts to portray Cortez as an unreliable witness fell flat in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. During the sentencing phase, Kendra's family members had the opportunity to address the court and describe the impact of her loss on their lives. They spoke of a daughter who had worked hard to build a successful career, a sister who had been generous and loving, and a friend who had touched countless lives through her work with children. Because of the agreement reached during the extradition process, Brenda Delgado could not be sentenced to death. Instead, she received life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensures she will never again be free to harm another person out of jealousy or rage. The conviction of Brenda Delgado brought legal closure to the murder of Dr. Kendra Hatcher, but the emotional and psychological wounds left by this crime continue to affect many people. Kendra's family lost a beloved daughter and sister whose life was just beginning to reach its full potential. Her patients lost a caring dentist who had made their children feel safe and comfortable during medical procedures. Her friends lost someone who had enriched their lives with her warmth and loyalty. Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, whose only crime was falling in love with a wonderful woman, has had to live with the knowledge that his ex-girlfriend murdered someone he cared about. The guilt and trauma associated with being an unwitting catalyst for such violence is something that no one should have to endure. The case also had broader implications for how we understand and respond to domestic violence and stalking. Brenda Delgado's behavior leading up to the murder, the obsessive surveillance, the inability to accept the end of the relationship, the escalating attempts to control and manipulate, represents a pattern that domestic violence experts recognize as extremely dangerous. Law enforcement agencies have used this case as a training example for recognizing the signs of potentially lethal stalking behavior. The months of surveillance and planning that preceded Kendra's murder might have been prevented if there had been better systems in place for identifying and responding to such threatening behavior. The international nature of the case also highlighted the challenges that law enforcement faces when criminals flee across borders. Brenda Delgado's ability to evade capture for several years by crossing into Mexico demonstrated the need for better cooperation and coordination between nations in pursuing fugitives. For the dental community in Dallas, Kendra's murder was particularly shocking because it struck at the heart of their professional family. She was one of their own, a colleague who had earned their respect through her skill and dedication to her patients. Her death served as a reminder that professional success and financial security cannot protect someone from the dangers of domestic violence and stalking. The case has also been studied by criminologists and psychologists interested in understanding the mindset that leads someone to commission murder rather than accept rejection. Brenda Delgado's actions represent an extreme form of narcissistic rage, where the loss of control over another person becomes so intolerable that murder seems preferable to acceptance. Perhaps most importantly, Kendra Hatcher's story serves as a reminder of the preciousness and fragility of human life. She was a woman who had worked hard to build a meaningful career, who brought joy and healing to children, and who was looking forward to building a future with someone she cared about. Her life had value far beyond the twisted obsessions of someone who saw her only as an obstacle to be removed. Today, Christopher Love sits on death row in Texas, awaiting execution for his role as the triggerman in Kendra's murder. Crystal Cortez is serving her 35-year sentence and will not be eligible for parole until she is well into middle age. And Brenda Delgado will spend the rest of her natural life in prison, paying the ultimate price for letting jealousy and obsession drive her to commit the ultimate crime. As we conclude this tragic story, it's worth reflecting on what the murder of Kendra Hatcher teaches us about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. Brenda Delgado was not a career criminal or someone with a history of violence. To most people who knew her, she appeared to be a successful, articulate, professional woman. She had the education, resources, and opportunities that should have enabled her to build a fulfilling life. Yet when faced with rejection and loss of control, she chose to respond with the most extreme form of violence imaginable. This case reminds us that evil often wears a familiar face. The person capable of commissioning murder might be the colleague in the next office, the neighbor down the street, or the ex-partner who seems unable to move on. The capacity for violence exists within the spectrum of human behavior, often hidden beneath a veneer of respectability and normalcy. The conspiracy that killed Kendra Hatcher also demonstrates how violence spreads and corrupts others. Crystal Cortez might never have committed a violent crime on her own, but her need for money made her willing to participate in someone else's murderous scheme. Christopher Love's history of violence made him the perfect weapon for someone who wanted to kill but couldn't do it herself. Yet, even in the face of such darkness, there are lessons about resilience and the triumph of justice. Kendra's family and friends have worked to ensure that her memory is honored and that her life continues to have meaning even after her death. Law enforcement officers spent years pursuing her killers, refusing to give up even when the trail went cold or crossed international borders. The legal system, despite its imperfections, ultimately provided justice for Kendra. All three people responsible for her death are now in prison, and two of them will never be free again. While this cannot bring Kendra back or undo the pain her loss has caused, it does provide some measure of closure and ensures that they cannot harm anyone else. Perhaps most importantly, Kendra's story serves as a call to action for all of us to be more aware of the warning signs of dangerous obsession and to take threats more seriously. The surveillance and stalking behavior that preceded her murder might have been prevented if there had been better recognition of the danger signs and more effective intervention. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Dr. Kendra Hatcher, not as a victim, but as a woman who lived her life with purpose and compassion. She dedicated herself to healing children, building relationships, and making the world a little bit better through her work and her presence. Though her life was cut tragically short, the impact she made during her 35 years continues to ripple outward, touching the lives of everyone who knew her and everyone who hears her story. In a world that can sometimes seem dominated by darkness and violence, people like Kendra Hatcher remind us of the good that exists in human nature. The drive to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate. Her legacy challenges us to be better, to choose compassion over cruelty, and to value the precious gift of life that can be taken away so suddenly and senselessly. The case may be closed, justice may have been served, but the memory of Dr. Kendra Hatcher lives on as a reminder of both the fragility of life and the enduring power of human goodness. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we'll explore one of North Carolina's most shocking betrayals. A tale of love, obsession, and ultimate deception that shattered a quiet community and ended in the calculated murder of a beloved businessman. In the gentle coastal town of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, where the Pasquotank River meets the Albemarle Sound, life moves at a slower pace. Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees, and neighbors still wave to each other from front porches lined with rocking chairs. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep, and where violent crime feels impossibly distant from the manicured lawns and tidy subdivisions. This peaceful community prided itself on being a safe haven, the kind of place where children could ride their bicycles until dark, where doors were left unlocked, and where the most exciting news usually involved high school football scores or the annual waterfront festival. But on the humid morning of August 2nd, 2018, that sense of security would be shattered forever by a tale so twisted, so filled with deception and betrayal, that it would leave residents questioning everything they thought they knew about the people living among them. The story begins not with the crime itself, but with Milton Henry Sawyer, Jr., affectionately known to friends and family as Little Mink. At 54 years old, Milton was the embodiment of the American dream, realized through patience, hard work, and an eye for hidden treasures. From childhood, he had possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot value where others saw junk. While other children collected baseball cards or toys, young Milton was drawn to antiques, vintage items, and collectibles with an intensity that would define his entire life. Milton's passion for antiques wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. He could walk through a dusty garage sale and immediately identify a piece of Depression-era glassware worth hundreds of dollars, or spot a Civil War-era artifact that others had dismissed as worthless. His knowledge was encyclopedic, built through decades of study, handling thousands of items, and developing relationships with collectors, dealers, and historians throughout the region. His expertise eventually blossomed into the Treasure Hunter Antique Store on North Road Street in downtown Elizabeth City. The shop became something of a local institution, a maze of carefully curated vintage furniture, rare books, antique jewelry, and curious artifacts from bygone eras. Visitors could spend hours browsing through Milton's collection, each item accompanied by a story that Milton would gladly share with anyone who showed genuine interest. The store wasn't just Milton's livelihood, it was his sanctuary. He would arrive each morning before dawn, unlocking the heavy wooden door with the kind of reverence others reserved for houses of worship. Inside, surrounded by the accumulated history of generations past, Milton found peace. He would carefully dust delicate porcelain figures, rearrange displays of vintage pocket watches, and research the provenance of newly acquired pieces with the dedication of a museum curator. Regular customers became friends, drawn not only by Milton's impressive inventory but by his warm personality and generous spirit. He had a gift for making people feel welcome, whether they were serious collectors with deep pockets, or curious browsers with nothing more than a few dollars to spend. Children were especially drawn to Milton, who would patiently explain the history behind various items and sometimes slip them small trinkets with a wink and a smile. But Milton's greatest treasure wasn't something he'd found at an estate sale or auction house. In 2012, he met Angel Marie, a woman whose beauty and charm seemed to light up whatever room she entered. Angel was striking, blonde hair that caught the light just so, bright blue eyes that sparkled with apparent warmth, and a smile that could make anyone feel like the most important person in the world. She possessed that particular kind of charisma that draws people in, making them feel special and chosen. Their courtship was swift and intense. Angel showed genuine interest in Milton's work, spending hours at the antique store, learning about different periods and styles, and demonstrating what appeared to be authentic fascination with his expertise. She would ask thoughtful questions about the provenance of various pieces, listen intently to his stories about remarkable finds, and even accompany him to estate sales and auctions throughout the region. To Milton, who had spent most of his adult life immersed in objects from the past, Angel represented something wonderfully present and alive. She brought energy and excitement into his orderly world, and he found himself completely captivated by her attention and apparent devotion. Friends and family watched as the typically reserved Milton became animated and joyful in ways they hadn't seen before. The couple married, and Angel seamlessly integrated herself into both Milton's personal life and his business. She took an active role in running the treasure hunter, demonstrating a natural aptitude for dealing with customers and an eye for valuable pieces that impressed even Milton. To outside observers, they appeared to be the perfect partnership, two people who had found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. Angel's presence transformed the antique store, where Milton had always been somewhat solitary in his work. Methodical and quiet, Angel brought a social energy that attracted new customers. She had a talent for making people feel comfortable and welcome, and her enthusiasm seemed genuine. She would greet regular customers by name, remember details about their families and interests, and help them find exactly what they were looking for among Milton's vast collection. The business thrived under their joint management. Angel proved to have excellent instincts for pricing and presentation, and she encouraged Milton to expand into online sales, helping him navigate the digital marketplace with patience and skill. They worked side by side daily, sharing meals at the small desk in the back of the store, discussing purchases and sales, planning for the future. For 6 years, this arrangement seemed to work beautifully. Milton appeared happier and more fulfilled than those close to him had ever seen him. He would speak proudly of Angel's contributions to the business, her insights into customer preferences, and her natural ability to spot valuable items. She had become not just his wife, but his true partner in every sense of the word. But beneath this seemingly perfect surface, cracks were beginning to form, hairline fractures in what appeared to be a solid foundation. The trouble began, as it often does, with something that seemed entirely innocent, a car accident. In late 2017, Angel was involved in a minor traffic collision. Though her injuries weren't severe, she complained of persistent neck and back pain that required ongoing physical therapy. Her doctor referred her to a local clinic where she would receive treatment from a licensed physical therapist named Isaac Dustin Melcher. Isaac, at 38, was everything Milton was not. Where Milton was gentle and soft-spoken, Isaac possessed an aggressive confidence that some found appealing and others found unsettling. He was physically imposing, tall and muscular, with the kind of presence that commanded attention when he entered a room. His work as a physical therapist required him to be hands-on with patients, and he had developed a reputation for being particularly effective with difficult cases. But Isaac carried secrets that his professional facade carefully concealed. Despite his respectable career, he struggled with financial problems, relationship issues, and a growing sense that life owed him more than he was receiving. He was the kind of man who believed that rules applied to other people, that his charm and physical presence should open doors that remained frustratingly closed. When Angel began her physical therapy sessions with Isaac, the attraction was immediate and mutual. For Angel, Isaac represented excitement and danger, qualities that her stable life with Milton, for all its comfort and security, seemed to lack. For Isaac, Angel was beautiful, seemingly sophisticated, and married to a successful businessman. Exactly the kind of woman he believed he deserved, but had never been able to attract or keep. Their relationship began with long conversations during therapy sessions, progressed to text messages throughout the day, and eventually evolved into clandestine meetings away from the clinic. Angel would tell Milton she was running errands or visiting friends, then spend hours with Isaac, sharing intimate details about her marriage and her growing dissatisfaction with her life. Milton, with the trusting nature that made him such a beloved figure in the community, initially noticed nothing amiss. Angel continued to work at the store, maintained their routines, and showed no obvious signs of duplicity. She was careful, calculating, and skilled at compartmentalizing her double life. When she was with Milton, she played the role of devoted wife with convincing sincerity. When she was with Isaac, she portrayed herself as trapped in a loveless marriage to a boring older man. But gradually, subtle changes began to manifest. Angel became slightly less interested in the day-to-day operations of the antique store. She would check her phone more frequently, step outside to take calls, and seem distracted during conversations with Milton. These changes were so gradual, so seemingly insignificant, that Milton initially attributed them to stress from her accident and ongoing physical therapy. However, as weeks turned to months, Milton's naturally observant nature, the same quality that allowed him to spot valuable antiques among piles of junk, began to detect patterns that troubled him. Angel's therapy appointments seemed to last longer than necessary. She was receiving more text messages than usual, often at odd hours. Most concerning, she had begun to withdraw physically and emotionally, creating distance where there had once been intimacy and partnership. Milton was not a confrontational person by nature. He preferred to observe, consider, and approach problems with patience and careful thought. But the growing evidence of Angel's infidelity became impossible to ignore. Finally, in early 2018, Milton decided to investigate his suspicions directly. He drove to the physical therapy clinic, where Angel was supposedly receiving treatment, and positioned himself where he could observe the building without being seen. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. Angel and Isaac emerged from the building together, not with the professional distance appropriate between patient and therapist, but with the easy intimacy of lovers. They stood close together, touching casually, sharing private jokes and lingering looks. For Milton, watching from his car, the betrayal was complete and devastating. The confrontation that followed was painful for everyone involved. Milton presented Angel with what he had seen, hoping against hope that there might be some innocent explanation. Instead, he was met with denials, gaslighting, and accusations that his suspicions were evidence of jealousy and paranoia. Angel insisted that Isaac was nothing more than her physical therapist, that any appearance of impropriety was the result of Milton's imagination and insecurity. But Milton was not easily deterred. His love for Angel was matched by his determination to understand the truth of his situation. He began paying closer attention to her behavior, checking phone records and quietly investigating her activities. The evidence he uncovered painted a picture of an extensive affair that had been ongoing for months. Faced with irrefutable proof, Angel finally admitted to the relationship, but characterized it as an emotional connection born out of her dissatisfaction with her marriage. She claimed that Milton had become distant and boring, that their relationship lacked passion and excitement. She painted herself as a victim of circumstances, a woman trapped in a marriage that no longer fulfilled her emotional needs. Milton, despite his heartbreak, was willing to work on their relationship. He suggested counseling, promised to make changes that would address Angel's concerns, and expressed his deep love and commitment to their marriage. He was prepared to forgive the affair if Angel would enter a relationship with Isaac and recommit to their partnership. But Angel had already traveled too far down a different path to consider retreat. Her affair with Isaac had evolved beyond simple physical attraction or emotional connection. Together they had begun to fantasize about a different future, one that didn't include Milton's continued existence. The conversations between Angel and Isaac during this period were careful and coded, conducted through encrypted messages and whispered discussions during their private meetings. But the underlying theme was consistent. Milton represented an obstacle to their happiness that needed to be removed. Initially, they discussed divorce as an option, but Angel was keenly aware that any settlement would likely leave her with less than she felt she deserved. Milton owned the antique store, the house they shared, and had accumulated savings and investments over decades of careful financial management. A divorce would mean starting over with a fraction of those assets, but Milton's death would potentially leave Angel with everything. The business, the property, the financial security she had grown accustomed to, plus the freedom to begin a new life with Isaac. This cold calculation began to dominate their private discussions. Isaac, with his physical confidence and criminal mindset, began to consider practical approaches to eliminating Milton. Angel, with her intimate knowledge of Milton's routines and habits, provided crucial intelligence that would make such a plan feasible. The evolution from fantasy to concrete planning took several months. They discussed various scenarios, considered different methods, and carefully evaluated the risks involved. Isaac's background in physical therapy had given him detailed knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, information that proved valuable as they planned their crime. They decided that the murder needed to appear random and unconnected to either of them. A home invasion robbery seemed like the perfect cover story. Elizabeth City's low crime rate would make such an incident shocking but believable, and the apparent randomness would deflect suspicion from those closest to Milton. The plan they eventually developed was diabolically simple. Angel would provide Isaac with access to the house and information about Milton's schedule. Isaac would enter during the early morning hours when the neighborhood was quiet and most residents were sleeping. He would kill Milton and stage the scene to look like a botched robbery. Angel would play the role of second victim, sustaining minor injuries that would support her story of being attacked by an unknown intruder. As August 2018 approached, their planning became more detailed and specific. They identified the optimal timing, established alibis, and rehearsed their stories. Isaac obtained the materials he would need: zip ties for restraints, gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and clothing that could be easily disposed of after the crime. Angel's performance during this period was particularly chilling. She continued to work alongside Milton at the antique store, sharing meals and maintaining the facade of their marriage while secretly counting down to his death. She showed no apparent guilt or hesitation about her plans, demonstrating a level of cold-blooded calculation that would later shock everyone who knew her. On August 1st, 2018, Angel made her final preparations. She gave Isaac a key to their house on Darien Drive, confirmed that Milton would be home and asleep during the planned time window, and reviewed the details of their story one last time. That evening, she and Milton shared what would be their final dinner together, watching television and discussing plans for the antique store that she knew would never come to fruition. The attack occurred in the early hours of August 2nd, just after midnight. Isaac used Angel's key to enter the house silently, making his way through the familiar layout to the master bedroom where Milton slept. The couple's home was located in a quiet subdivision where houses were spaced far enough apart that sounds were unlikely to carry to neighbors. Isaac brought zip ties, and had planned to restrain both victims as part of the staged robbery scenario. But when he reached the bedroom, something went wrong. Perhaps Milton awakened more quickly than anticipated. Or maybe Isaac's nerves got the better of him. Instead of following their carefully laid plan, Isaac immediately attacked Milton with overwhelming violence. The struggle was brief, but brutal. Milton awakened from sleep and caught completely off guard, had no opportunity to defend himself against Isaac's aggressive assault. Isaac dragged him from the bedroom to the master bathroom, where he used what he later described as a rear naked choke, a strangling technique that cut off blood flow to Milton's brain. Milton fought for his life in those final moments, but he was no match for Isaac's size, strength, and preparation. The strangulation was quick and efficient, requiring only minutes to complete. Milton Henry Sawyer Jr., then beloved antique dealer and devoted husband, died on his bathroom floor while his wife waited in another room for confirmation that their plan had succeeded. After Milton's death, Isaac and Angel worked together to stage the crime scene. They scattered items throughout the house to simulate a burglary, damaged furniture and belongings to suggest a violent struggle, and carefully positioned Milton's body to support their story of a home invasion gone wrong. Angel's injuries were self-inflicted and carefully calculated. She struck her head against a table hard enough to draw blood and create visible trauma, but not severely enough to require extensive medical treatment. The injuries needed to be convincing to first responders and hospital staff, but minor enough that she could recover quickly and avoid detailed medical examination. With the scene prepared and her injuries inflicted, Angel called for help, but instead of dialing 911 directly, she ran to a neighbor's house, appearing panicked and bleeding, claiming that masked intruders had broken into her home, attacked both her and Milton, and fled after robbing them. The neighbor, awakened by Angel's frantic pounding on their door, immediately called emergency services. Within minutes, the quiet subdivision was filled with the flashing lights of police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks. First responders found Angel bleeding and apparently traumatized, claiming that her husband was still inside the house and might be seriously injured. Deputy Jeremy Wheelbarger was among the first officers to arrive at the scene. He knew Milton personally from around town, and was shocked to learn that the beloved antique dealer had been the victim of what appeared to be a violent crime. Wheelbarger entered the house with other deputies, unsure of what they would find inside the tidy suburban home. The scene that greeted them was one of apparent chaos. Furniture was overturned, belongings were scattered across multiple rooms, and there were obvious signs of a violent struggle. They found Milton's body in the master bathroom, positioned in a way that suggested he had been killed during an attempted robbery. Angel was transported to the hospital for treatment of her injuries, maintaining her story that unknown intruders had attacked them during a home invasion. Medical staff found her injuries consistent with being struck in the head, and her emotional state appeared genuine to those treating her. She provided a detailed account of the attack to investigators, describing masked men who had demanded money and valuables before turning violent when Milton tried to resist. But even as Angel was being treated at the hospital and providing her statement to police, investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in her story and the physical evidence at the scene. The supposed robbery showed signs of staging that experienced detectives recognized. Items were scattered in patterns that didn't match the chaos of a genuine home invasion. Valuable objects were left behind while less expensive items were supposedly taken. The violence seemed both excessive and strangely focused. Most significantly, the zip ties found at the scene appeared to have been cut rather than broken during a struggle, suggesting that the restraints had been applied and then deliberately removed as part of staging the crime scene. This detail would prove crucial as the investigation progressed. Within hours of the crime, investigators were already questioning whether Angel's account of events matched the physical evidence, but they proceeded carefully, treating her as a victim while quietly beginning to investigate the possibility that she might have been involved in her husband's death. The initial investigation focused on the apparent home invasion, with police canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses, checking for signs of forced entry, and attempting to identify potential suspects who might have targeted the Sawyer home. But as they dug deeper into Milton and Angel's background, a different picture began to emerge. Detectives learned about Milton's suspicions regarding Angel's affair, his confrontation with Isaac Melcher, and the ongoing marital problems that had been carefully hidden from most of their friends and family. This information shifted the investigation's focus from unknown intruders to the people closest to Milton who might have had motives for wanting him dead. Isaac Melcher became a person of interest almost immediately once investigators learned about his relationship with Angel. His background check revealed financial problems, a history of poor decision-making, and the physical capabilities necessary to overpower Milton. But proving his involvement would require more than circumstantial evidence and motive. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, a dairy farmer and volunteer youth pastor named Louis Casimir, living thousands of miles away from Elizabeth City. Isaac had confided in Casimir about his involvement in Milton's murder, apparently needing to share the burden of what he had done with someone he trusted. Casimir found himself in an impossible situation. As a man of faith and conscience, he was horrified by what Isaac had told him, but he also felt a responsibility to help law enforcement bring Milton's killers to justice. After much internal struggle, Casimir contacted authorities and agreed to help them obtain evidence against Isaac. Working with investigators, Casimir engaged Isaac in recorded conversations where Isaac provided detailed confessions about his role in Milton's murder. During these conversations, Isaac described the planning process, his entry into the Sawyer home, the killing itself, and the staging that followed. These recordings provided law enforcement with everything they needed to arrest and prosecute both Isaac and Angel. On August 21, 2018, nearly 3 weeks after Milton's murder, both Angel Sawyer and Isaac Melcher were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrest shocked Elizabeth City residents who had rallied around Angel as a victim of random violence, only to discover that she had orchestrated her husband's death. The evidence against both defendants was overwhelming, but their legal fates would unfold differently. Isaac, faced with his recorded confessions and the physical evidence linking him to the crime, eventually agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Angel. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a term that acknowledged his cooperation while still holding him accountable for his role in Milton's death. Angel's case proved more complex. Despite Isaac's testimony and the circumstantial evidence of her involvement, proving her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt required prosecutors to demonstrate that she had planned and participated in Milton's murder, rather than simply being an unfaithful wife who happened to survive a random attack. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Kimberly Pellini, painted a picture of Angel as the mastermind behind Milton's murder, a calculating woman who had manipulated Isaac into killing her husband so she could inherit his assets and begin a new life. They presented evidence of the couple's financial situation, Angel's affair with Isaac, and the staging of the crime scene that pointed to inside knowledge and careful planning. Angel's defense team argued that she had been a victim of both the crime and Isaac's manipulation, suggesting that any involvement she might have had was the result of coercion rather than willing participation. They portrayed her as a woman trapped between a jealous husband and an increasingly unstable lover, caught in a situation that spiraled beyond her control. The trial revealed the full extent of the deception and planning that had preceded Milton's murder. Witnesses testified about Angel's behavior before and after the crime. Experts analyzed the physical evidence from the scene, and Isaac provided detailed testimony about their conspiracy and its execution. In September 2021, after deliberating the evidence and testimony, A jury found Angel Sawyer guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The conviction reflected their conclusion that she had been an active participant in planning and executing Milton's death, rather than an innocent victim of circumstances. Angel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a term that reflected the premeditated nature of the crime, and her central role in orchestrating her husband's murder. Her conviction was later upheld by the North Carolina Court of Appeals, ensuring that she would spend the remainder of her life paying for her betrayal of Milton's trust and love. The resolution of the case brought some measure of justice for Milton's family and friends, but it could never restore what had been lost. Milton Sawyer had been a beloved figure in Elizabeth City, a man whose passion for antiques and generous spirit had enriched the lives of countless people who knew him. His death left a void in the community that continues to be felt by those whose lives he touched. The Treasure Hunter antique store, which had been Milton's pride and joy, was eventually closed and its contents dispersed. The carefully curated collection that represented decades of Milton's expertise and dedication was scattered to estate sales and other dealers, ending the legacy he had worked so carefully to build. For the residents of Elizabeth City, the case served as a stark reminder that evil can lurk beneath the most ordinary surfaces, that the people we trust most completely may be capable of the most profound betrayals. The quiet subdivision where Milton died would never quite feel as safe as it had before. That August morning in 2018, perhaps most chilling of all was the realization of how close Angel and Isaac had come to getting away with their crime. If not for the courage of Louis Casimir, who risked his own safety to help investigators obtain Isaac's confession, the case might never have been solved. Angel might have successfully played the role of grieving widow, inherited Milton's assets, and begun a new life with Isaac, free from consequences for their actions. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of trusting people in intimate relationships. Milton's love for Angel had blinded him to the full extent of her deception and manipulation. His willingness to forgive her affair and work on their marriage had been met not with reciprocal effort, but with calculated planning for his element. As we reflect on this tragic story, we're reminded of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences that can follow when love is met with betrayal. Milton Sawyer deserved better than the fate that befell him. He deserved the loyalty and honesty he had shown to others throughout his life. His memory lives on not in the manner of his death, but in the impact he had during his 54 years of life. The customers who found treasures in his store, the friends who enjoyed his company and conversation, and the family members who knew his generous heart, they carry forward the true legacy of Milton Henry Sawyer Jr. The antiques that Milton loved so much were valuable because they connected us to the past, because they carried forward the stories and craftsmanship of generations before us. In much the same way, the memory of Milton himself serves as a connection to the values of honesty, dedication, and genuine care for others that seem increasingly rare in our modern world. As we conclude this tragic tale, we're left with questions about trust, love, and the darkness that can exist in human hearts. But we're also reminded of the importance of justice, the courage of those who speak truth in difficult circumstances, and the enduring impact that good people can have on the communities they serve. Milton Sawyer's story ended in betrayal and violence, but his life was defined by much more than its tragic conclusion. In Elizabeth City, North Carolina, his name is still spoken with respect and affection by those who knew him. And perhaps that in the end is the most fitting tribute to a man whose life was dedicated to preserving the treasures of the past for future generations to discover and enjoy. The case of Milton Sawyer's murder serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the complexity of human relationships. It shows us how quickly trust can be betrayed, how carefully evil can disguise itself, and how justice, though sometimes slow in coming, can ultimately prevail through the courage of ordinary people willing to do the right thing. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Anthem in Broomfield, Colorado, where manicured lawns stretch between modern homes and children's laughter, echoes from backyard playsets, no one could have imagined the sinister plot unfolding behind the closed doors of 300 block home. This is a story that defies every assumption we make about safety, trust, and the people we believe we know best. It's the story of Crystal Krug, a devoted mother whose greatest fear wasn't the stranger lurking in shadows, but the man who slept beside her every night. The year was 2023, and 43-year-old Crystal Krug seemed to have everything many people dream of. She lived in a beautiful home with her husband Daniel, a respected government employee who worked steady hours and provided well for their family. Together they were raising 3 children in what appeared to be an idyllic suburban setting. Crystal was the kind of mother who never missed a school pickup, who packed thoughtful lunches, and who could be counted on to remember every important detail of her children's lives. But beneath this picture-perfect facade, something deeply troubling was beginning to surface. It started in October 2023, when Crystal's phone began receiving messages that would transform her daily life into a waking nightmare. The texts were disturbing, sexual in nature, and increasingly threatening. They came from someone claiming to be Anthony Holland, an ex-boyfriend from Crystal's past, someone she hadn't spoken to or seen in decades. Picture Crystal's confusion and growing fear as these messages continued to arrive. Anthony Holland had been a brief relationship from her distant past, someone she barely thought about anymore. Yet here he was, or so it seemed, reaching across the years with increasingly disturbing communications. The messages weren't just inappropriate, they were escalating in their intensity and their threats. What made this situation even more terrifying for Crystal was the intimate knowledge the sender seemed to possess about her current life. Details about her daily routines, her children, her whereabouts, information that suggested this person wasn't just reaching out from the past, but was actively watching her present life. The messages contained crude photos and sexual content that left Crystal feeling violated and afraid. As weeks passed, the harassment intensified. Crystal found herself looking over her shoulder, checking locks twice, and feeling a constant sense of unease that no amount of security measures seemed to alleviate. She shared her fears with her husband Daniel, showing him the disturbing messages and seeking comfort in his presence. Daniel appeared supportive and concerned, encouraging her to document everything and suggesting they involve law enforcement. The psychological toll on Crystal was immense. Here was a woman who had built a stable, secure life for herself and her children, suddenly thrust into a situation where she felt hunted and helpless. The messages weren't just words on a screen. They represented a constant invasion of her peace of mind, a theft of the security she had worked so hard to create. What Crystal didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the person tormenting her wasn't a blast from her past at all. The man sending these disturbing messages, the phantom who seemed to know every detail of her life, wasn't Anthony Holland reaching out after decades of silence. The person systematically destroying her sense of safety was someone much closer to home. Daniel Krug, her husband of years, the father of their children, the man she trusted above all others, was orchestrating every terrifying moment of her ordeal, while she sought comfort in his arms after receiving another threatening message. While she shared her fears and asked for his protection, Daniel was the very source of her terror. The psychology behind Daniel's actions reveals a level of manipulation that is difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated, sustained campaign of psychological warfare against his own wife, carried out over months with meticulous attention to detail. Daniel was creating the problem and positioning himself as the solution, feeding off Crystal's dependency on him for comfort while simultaneously being the architect of her suffering. But why would a husband, a father, a man who had shared years of his life with Crystal, choose to terrorize her in this way? What could have motivated such an elaborate and cruel deception? The answers to these questions would only become clear much later, through the painstaking work of investigators, who would uncover a digital trail of evidence that painted a picture of a man whose public persona masked something far more sinister. As November turned to December in 2023, the messages continued. Crystal was living in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next disturbing communication would arrive. She had contacted police, but tracking down someone from her past who seemed to be using technology to hide his identity was proving challenging for investigators. December 14th, 2023, began like many other days in the Krug household. Crystal went through her morning routine, making sure the children were ready for school, preparing herself for another day while carrying the weight of constant worry about her stalker. Daniel, as he had done countless times before, helped with the morning routine, presenting himself as the concerned, protective husband. After dropping the children at school, Crystal returned home to their house in the Anthem neighborhood. The garage door opened. She pulled in and began gathering her things to head inside. In these mundane moments, in the familiar space of her own garage, Crystal had no reason to believe that her life was about to end. What happened next was swift and brutal. Daniel, the man who had comforted her through months of fear, the person she turned to for safety, attacked her from behind. The assault was vicious and calculated. He struck her multiple times in the head with a blunt object, causing devastating trauma. But the head injuries weren't enough. In a final fatal act, Daniel stabbed his wife directly in the heart. The location of the fatal wound tells us something important about Daniel's state of mind. This wasn't a frenzied attack or a struggle that went wrong. The precision of that final blow suggests someone who wanted to ensure death was certain and swift. It was the act of someone who had thought about this moment, planned for it, and executed it with terrible efficiency. But Daniel's planning didn't stop with the murder itself. Even as Crystal lay dying in their garage, even as he stood over the body of the mother of his children, Daniel was already working on his cover story. In a move that reveals the calculating nature of his mind, he took Crystal's phone and used it to send text messages, creating the illusion that she was still alive and moving about her day normally. Using her device, Daniel disabled their home security system, a system that might have recorded evidence of his crime. He covered their doorbell camera with blue masking tape, ensuring that his movements wouldn't be captured. These weren't the panicked actions of someone who had acted impulsively. These were the careful steps of someone executing a premeditated plan. Daniel's attempt to establish an alibi was elaborate. After committing the murder, he used Crystal's phone to send messages that would suggest she was going about her normal activities. He created a digital trail designed to confuse the timeline and make it appear as though she was alive well after he had actually killed her. But even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces. And modern forensic science has ways of uncovering truths that criminals never expect. When Broomfield Police Department investigators arrived at the scene, they began the meticulous work of reconstructing not just what had happened, but who was responsible. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Daniel's deception. Digital forensic experts began examining phones, computers, and other electronic devices, looking for clues about both the murder and the stalking campaign that had preceded it. What they found was a trail of evidence that led directly back to Daniel Krug. The text messages that had terrorized Christie for months, the messages she believed were coming from her ex-boyfriend Anthony Holland, had actually been sent by her husband. Digital analysis revealed that Daniel had been using various methods to disguise his identity, creating fake accounts and using technology to make it appear as though the messages were coming from someone else entirely. Investigators found something else equally damning on Daniel's devices. The day before the murder, he had conducted internet searches that revealed his premeditation. He had looked up questions like, how hard would you have to hit someone in the head to make them unconscious? And when is a head injury a cause for concern? These searches, preserved in his browsing history, painted a picture of someone researching the very methods he would use to kill his wife. The real Anthony Holland, Crystal's actual ex-boyfriend from decades past, was quickly ruled out as a suspect. He was living his life hundreds of miles away, completely unaware that his identity was being used in this sinister plot. The man Crystal had feared, the phantom from her past who seemed to be stalking her, existed only in Daniel's twisted imagination and his cruel manipulation of her trust. As the investigation deepened, a picture emerged of Daniel Krug that was vastly different from the concerned husband he had presented himself to be. Here was a man who had spent months psychologically torturing his wife, watching her suffer, comforting her when she was afraid, all while knowing that he was the source of her terror. The level of psychological manipulation involved suggests someone who not only lacked empathy for his victim, but actually derived some form of satisfaction from her suffering. The case against Daniel was largely circumstantial, but it was overwhelming in its completeness. While investigators never found significant physical evidence, no blood on Daniel's clothes or in his car, no DNA definitively linking him to the crime scene, the digital evidence told a story that was impossible to ignore. The prosecution would later argue that the absence of physical evidence actually supported their theory of premeditation. This wasn't a crime that happened in the heat of the moment. This was a carefully planned murder executed by someone who had thought through the evidence he might leave behind and taken steps to minimize it. Daniel's defense team would argue that the lack of physical evidence created reasonable doubt about his guilt. They pointed out that investigators had found partial DNA from an unknown individual at the crime scene, suggesting that someone else might have been responsible. They criticized the police investigation, arguing that investigators had focused on Daniel too quickly and failed to adequately explore other possibilities. But the digital trail was too comprehensive to ignore. The months of fake stalking messages, the internet searches about head injuries, the use of Crystal's phone after her death to create false alibis. All of this evidence painted a picture of Daniel as not just Crystal's killer, but as someone who had been planning her death for months while simultaneously terrorizing her. The trial of Daniel Krug began in early 2025, nearly a year and a half after Crystal's death. Over the course of several weeks, prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece, showing jurors how Daniel had created an elaborate fiction to terrorize his wife, before ultimately killing her. Witnesses testified about Crystal's fear during the months of harassment, describing how the threatening messages had affected every aspect of her life. Digital forensic experts explained how they had traced the stalking messages back to Daniel, walking jurors through the technical evidence that revealed his deception. The prosecution painted a picture of Daniel as a master manipulator, who had betrayed the most fundamental bonds of trust. Here was a man who had promised to love and protect his wife, who had stood beside her as she feared for her safety, all while being the very person she needed protection from. Daniel's defense team fought back with their own interpretation of the evidence. They argued that the case against their client was built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence and the presence of unknown DNA at the crime scene as proof that investigators had rushed to judgment. Defense attorneys suggested that the real killer might have been the very person Crystal thought was stalking her, perhaps Anthony Holland or someone connected to him. They argued that Daniel was being railroaded by investigators who had decided he was guilty and then looked for evidence to support that conclusion rather than following the evidence wherever it might lead. But the prosecution's case was simply too comprehensive. The digital evidence showed a pattern of behavior that extended over months, a level of planning and manipulation that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or misinterpretation. The jury was presented with a clear narrative. Daniel Krug had terrorized his wife for months, then killed her when his psychological torture was no longer sufficient. The testimony phase of the trial was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Crystal's family members took the stand to describe the woman they had lost. Not just a victim, but a loving mother, a devoted daughter, a person whose life had value far beyond the circumstances of her death. Her children, now without both parents, one dead, the other facing life in prison, represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case. These young people had lost their mother to violence, and their father to his own choices, leaving them to navigate the rest of their childhoods and their adult lives with the knowledge of what had happened in their family. As the trial progressed, more details emerged about Daniel's state of mind and possible motives. While prosecutors didn't need to prove motive to secure a conviction, the question of why Daniel had chosen this path remained central to understanding the case. Some evidence suggested that Daniel may have been planning to leave Crystal and wanted to avoid the financial and custody complications of a divorce. By creating the illusion that she was being stalked by an ex-boyfriend who then killed her, Daniel may have believed he could eliminate his wife while positioning himself as a grieving widower, rather than a murder suspect. Other evidence suggested that Daniel may have derived psychological satisfaction from his wife's fear and dependence on him during the stalking period. The months of harassment had made Crystal more reliant on Daniel for emotional support and protection, giving him a level of control over her that he may have found gratifying. Whatever his ultimate motivation, the evidence was clear that Daniel's actions were premeditated and calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was a sustained campaign of psychological warfare, followed by a carefully planned murder. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Daniel Krug was found guilty on all counts: criminal impersonation, stalking, and first-degree murder. The digital evidence had proven more compelling than the lack of physical evidence, and jurors had seen through Daniel's attempt to create reasonable doubt about his guilt. The sentencing phase was swift. For the crime of first-degree murder, Daniel Krug was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 44 years old, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying the price for the elaborate and cruel plot that had cost Crystal her life and destroyed their children's family. But even with Daniel convicted and sentenced, questions remain about this case that extend beyond the specific tragedy of the Krug family. Crystal's family members have criticized the slow response of telecommunications companies to law enforcement requests for information during the investigation. According to some family members, if phone and internet companies had responded more quickly to search warrants and requests for user information, investigators might have identified Daniel as the source of the stalking messages while Crystal was still alive. This raises difficult questions about the balance between privacy rights and public safety and whether current systems are adequate to protect victims of cyberstalking and harassment. The case also highlights the particular dangers of domestic abuse situations, where the abuser is the person the victim turns to for protection. Traditional domestic violence involves recognizable patterns of control and abuse within a relationship. But Daniel's approach was far more insidious. He created an external threat that drove Crystal to depend on him more heavily, all while being the very person she needed protection from. This type of manipulation represents a particularly sophisticated form of psychological abuse. By positioning himself as Crystal's protector while simultaneously being her tormentor, Daniel was able to exercise control over her in ways that were invisible even to Crystal herself. She experienced his comfort and support as genuine, never realizing that he was the architect of her suffering. The Crystal Krug case serves as a reminder that our assumptions about safety and trust can sometimes be our greatest vulnerabilities. We expect danger to come from strangers, from people whose intentions are obvious and whose threats are direct. We don't expect the people we love most, the people we trust with our lives and our children's lives, to be capable of such elaborate deception and cruelty. For those who knew the Krug family, the revelation of Daniel's guilt was shocking and difficult to accept. Neighbors described Daniel as a quiet, responsible man who seemed devoted to his family. Co-workers knew him as a reliable government employee, who did his job without drama or incidents. The idea that this seemingly ordinary man was capable of months of psychological torture, followed by premeditated murder, challenged everything they thought they knew about reading people and recognizing danger. The children at the center of this tragedy now face the difficult task of rebuilding their lives in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. They must process not only their mother's death, but the knowledge that their father was responsible for it. They must find ways to honor their mother's memory while coming to terms with the reality of who their father really was. Crystal's extended family has stepped up to care for the children, providing stability and love during this incredibly difficult time. But the scars of this trauma will likely last a lifetime, affecting how these young people understand family, trust, and safety as they grow into adults. The case has also had a broader impact on the Broomfield community, where residents have had to confront the reality that such calculated evil can exist behind the facade of suburban normalcy. The Anthem neighborhood, where the Krug family lived, is the kind of place where people move specifically because they believe it's safe for raising children. The murder of Crystal Krug shattered that sense of security and forced residents to reconsider their assumptions about the people living around them. Law enforcement officials have used this case to highlight the importance of taking stalking and harassment seriously, even when the threats seem to come from familiar sources or ex-partners. They emphasize that modern technology makes it easier than ever for stalkers to hide their identities and create elaborate deceptions, making thorough investigation crucial even in cases where the victim believes they know who is threatening them. The case has also been featured on major television programs, including serving as the subject of Dateline NBC's milestone 3000th episode. The widespread media attention reflects both the shocking nature of Daniel's deception and the broader questions the case raises about trust, domestic violence, and the ways technology can be used to facilitate abuse. From a legal perspective, the Krug case demonstrates how digital forensic evidence has become crucial in modern criminal investigations. While traditional physical evidence like DNA and fingerprints remains important, the digital trails we leave through our phones, computers, and internet activity often provide the most complete picture of a person's actions and intentions. The internet searches Daniel conducted the day before the murder, the metadata from the stalking messages, the digital manipulation of the home security system, all of these electronic breadcrumbs told a story that was impossible for Daniel to erase or explain away. In an age where we live increasingly digital lives, these electronic traces have become powerful tools for both law enforcement and the justice system. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Crystal Krug case is about the nature of evil itself. Daniel Krug wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows or a career criminal with a history of violence. He was an ordinary man who made extraordinary choices about how to treat another human being. He chose deception over honesty, manipulation over respect, and ultimately violence over whatever alternatives might have existed. The months Daniel spent terrorizing Crystal, watching her suffer, comforting her while knowing he was the source of her pain, These actions reveal a capacity for cruelty that goes far beyond simple anger or frustration. They suggest someone who is capable of viewing his wife, not as a fellow human being deserving of love and respect, but as an object to be manipulated and ultimately disposed of when she was no longer useful to him. This level of dehumanization is perhaps what makes the case so disturbing. We can understand crimes of passion, moments when anger or jealousy override better judgment. We can even understand calculated crimes motivated by greed or desperation, but the sustained psychological torture Daniel inflicted on Crystal, the elaborate deception he maintained while comforting her, requires a kind of moral emptiness that is difficult to comprehend. As we reflect on Crystal Krug's story, we're reminded that the people who seem most trustworthy, most normal, most integrated into our communities, are still capable of choices that can shatter lives and destroy families. The challenge is learning to maintain appropriate vigilance and healthy boundaries, while still being able to form the trusting relationships that make life meaningful. Crystal Krug was 43 years old when she died. A woman in the prime of her life with children who needed her and a future that should have stretched ahead for decades. Her death represents not just the end of one life, but the loss of all the experiences, relationships, and contributions she might have made if Daniel had chosen differently. Her children will grow up without their mother's guidance, wisdom, and love. They will graduate from high school, go to college, get married, and have children of their own without Crystal there to share those milestones. The ripple effects of Daniel's choices will impact not just the immediate family, but generations yet to come. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in the comfort of your own home, surrounded by the people you trust most, remember Crystal Krug. Remember that she was more than just a victim in a true crime story. She was a mother who packed school lunches and remembered permission slip deadlines. She was a woman who trusted the wrong person with her life, and paid the ultimate price for that trust. Her story serves as both a warning and a reminder, a warning that danger can come from the most unexpected sources, and a reminder that every life has value that extends far beyond the circumstances of its end. In remembering Crystal, we honor not just her memory, but the memories of all those who have been lost to violence, betrayal, and the failures of those who were supposed to protect them. The phantom that terrorized Crystal Krug wasn't a stranger from her past, but the man who shared her present and should have been part of her future. In the quiet suburb of Broomfield, Colorado, behind the closed doors of a house that should have been a sanctuary, a husband became his wife's greatest fear and ultimate destroyer. And with that terrible revelation, we're reminded that sometimes the most dangerous person in our life is the one we never thought to fear. Daniel Krug now sits in a prison cell where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. But Crystal Krug's story continues in the lives of the children she left behind, in the family members who loved her, and in the lessons her tragedy teaches us about trust, safety, and the precious fragility of the lives we build with those we believe we can depend on. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the sprawling desert city of Las Vegas, where neon lights pierce through endless nights and dreams are both made and shattered, there lived a woman whose laughter could fill any room. Her name was Shauna Tyaf, and her story is one that reveals how the most ordinary seeming lives can harbor the darkest of secrets. Shauna was born in Salt Lake City, raised in the traditions of the Mormon faith, with values that emphasized family, devotion, and finding joy in life's simple pleasures. She was the kind of person who sang while she worked, who made friends easily, and whose presence seemed to brighten whatever space she occupied. Those who knew her described her as having an infectious laugh and an almost childlike innocence that remained untouched by the cynicism that city life often brings. At 28, like countless others before her, Shauna made her way to Las Vegas. It wasn't the glittering casinos or the promise of easy money that drew her there, but simply life's natural progression. She found work as a cocktail waitress at the Palms Casino, one of the newer and more upscale establishments on the Strip. The work was demanding, the hours long, But Shauna approached it with the same warmth and dedication she brought to everything in her life. It was in this city of temporary relationships and fleeting encounters that Shauna met George Tyaf. George was a Las Vegas firefighter, a man who on the surface represented stability and heroism in a city known for its excesses. Tall, attractive, and charming, George seemed to be everything a woman might want in a partner. He had chosen a career dedicated to saving lives, protecting the community, and serving others. To those who knew them as a couple, George and Shauna appeared to be living proof that even in Las Vegas, genuine love stories could flourish. Their romance blossomed in the way that many great love stories do. Gradually, then all at once, George would tell friends that he was captivated by Shauna's authenticity, her genuine nature in a city where so many people wore masks. Shauna, for her part, was drawn to George's apparent stability and his profession as a protector and helper. Here was a man who ran toward danger when others ran away, who dedicated his life to saving others. They married, and for a time their life together seemed like a testament to the possibility of finding real happiness amidst the artificial glamour of Las Vegas. George continued his work with the fire department, earning respect from his colleagues and building a reputation as a dependable firefighter. Shauna continued working at the Palms, where her friendly demeanor made her popular with customers and co-workers alike. Their happiness seemed to reach its peak with the birth of their daughter, Madison, Maddie to those who loved her. For Shauna, motherhood was a role she embraced with her entire being. Those who observed her with Maddie described a transformation that was beautiful to witness. When she was with her daughter, it was as if nothing else in the world existed. She was completely present, completely devoted, singing to her child, reading stories with animated voices, and creating a world of warmth and security around the little girl. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family life, cracks were beginning to form. The pressures of raising a child, maintaining two demanding careers, and managing the financial responsibilities of a growing family began to take their toll on George in particular. Those who knew him during this period noticed changes in his demeanor. The easy charm that had once defined him began to give way to something harder, more controlling. Friends and family members would later recall subtle signs that all was not well in the Tyaf household. George began to show what they described as manipulative behavior toward Shauna. He would make subtle criticisms of her appearance, her work, her parenting, always delivered with just enough plausible deniability that they could be dismissed as concern rather than cruelty. Shauna, with her trusting nature and desire to maintain harmony in her family, often made excuses for George's increasingly difficult behavior. The verbal abuse, when it began, was insidious in the way that emotional cruelty often is. It started small, comments about Shauna's weight, criticism of her housekeeping, questions about her commitment to the family. George would apologize after these incidents, claiming stress from work or financial pressures, and Shauna, wanting to believe in the man she had married, would forgive him. As the years passed, the dynamic in their household shifted. George seemed to need to exert control over every aspect of Shauna's life. He monitored her activities, questioned her friendships, and gradually isolated her from many of the relationships that had once brought her joy. Shauna's naturally outgoing personality began to dim under this constant scrutiny and criticism. The financial crisis of 2008 brought additional stress to their marriage. Like many families across America, the Tyaf faced economic uncertainty. George's concerns about money became another weapon in his arsenal of control. He criticized Shauna's spending on even the most basic necessities, made her account for every dollar, and used their financial situation as justification for his increasingly domineering behavior. By 2012, after nearly 10 years of marriage, Shauna had reached her breaking point. The woman who had once filled rooms with laughter had become a shadow of her former self. The emotional abuse had worn down her self-esteem and her hope for their marriage. Friends noticed that she seemed sad, withdrawn, and anxious in ways that were completely foreign to her natural temperament. In April of 2012, Shauna made the difficult decision to separate from George. She moved out of their family home and into a townhouse in a quiet development, taking Maddie with her. It was a step that required tremendous courage, as it meant acknowledging that the life she had tried so hard to preserve was beyond saving. Even after the separation, Shauna remained reluctant to take the final step of filing for divorce. Part of this hesitation came from her religious background, which valued the sanctity of marriage, but much of it came from her genuine hope that somehow their family might still be salvaged. She agreed to shared custody arrangements, allowing George regular time with Maddie, and tried to maintain civility for their daughter's sake. George, however, did not accept the separation with grace. To him, Shauna's decision to leave represented more than the end of their marriage. It represented a loss of control that he found intolerable. The woman he had worked so hard to dominate had finally found the strength to walk away, and this rejection ignited something dark and dangerous within him. The custody arrangement meant that George and Shauna were in regular contact, and those interactions became increasingly tense. George would use their exchanges about Maddie as opportunities to attempt to manipulate Shauna back into the marriage. When those attempts failed, his behavior became more erratic and threatening. In September of 2012, just weeks before her death, something troubling happened at Shauna's townhouse. She discovered that someone had broken into her home while she was away. The intruder hadn't taken much, mainly her wedding ring, which seemed symbolically significant, but perhaps most unsettling was the fact that whoever had been in her home had used her shower and had left behind a pair of boxer shorts. The break-in left Shauna feeling vulnerable and afraid. She reported it to police, but with limited evidence and no clear suspects, there was little they could do. The incident added another layer of stress to an already difficult period in her life. She began to worry about her safety and Maddie's, wondering if the separation had made her a target for some unknown threat. What Shauna didn't know was that the break-in was no random crime. It was part of a calculated plan being orchestrated by her estranged husband, a plan that would soon escalate into something unthinkably horrible. George had not accepted their separation as permanent. In his mind, Shauna remained his possession, and her defiance in leaving him was something that required correction. But more than his wounded pride, George was motivated by practical concerns. A divorce would mean splitting their assets, paying alimony and child support, and losing the financial control he had exercised over their household for years. As Shauna settled into her new life and began to show signs of healing from the emotional abuse she had endured, George was plotting something that revealed the true darkness of his character. He had begun cultivating a relationship with a homeless man named Noel Stevens, known on the streets by the nickname Greyhound. Stevens was a drifter who had struggled with addiction and had spent years living on the margins of society. He was the kind of person who was largely invisible to most of the world, surviving on odd jobs and the kindness of strangers. George began offering Stevens small jobs, handyman work, cleaning, basic repairs, and gradually built what Stevens believed to be a friendship. Over the course of several weeks, George carefully manipulated Stevens, feeding him stories about Shauna that were designed to make her seem like a threat or an enemy. He told Stevens that Shauna was trying to take everything from him, that she was preventing him from seeing his daughter, that she was destroying his life. He painted himself as a victim of a vindictive woman who was using the legal system to ruin him. The manipulation was calculated and ruthless. George understood that Stevens, in his vulnerable position, was susceptible to offers of friendship and financial support. He gradually increased the nature of his requests, moving from legitimate handyman work to more questionable activities. The break-in at Shauna's townhouse had been Stevens' work, carried out at George's direction. It had served multiple purposes. It allowed George to retrieve items he claimed belonged to him. It gave Stevens access to the layout of Shauna's home, and it established a pattern of criminal activity that George hoped would provide cover for what he was planning next. As September progressed, George's requests of Stevens became more explicit. He began talking about needing Stevens to do something more permanent about his problem with Shauna. The conversations were carefully crafted to avoid explicit direction while making George's desires clear. He spoke about how much better his life would be if Shauna were out of the picture, how her death would solve all of his problems. Stevens, isolated and dependent on George's friendship and financial support, gradually came to understand what was being asked of him. The homeless man found himself being drawn into a conspiracy that he was ill-equipped to resist or fully comprehend. George provided Stevens with specific information about Shauna's routines, her work schedule, and the layout of her home. He gave him keys to the townhouse and detailed instructions about when and how to carry out the attack. The plan was for Stevens to wait inside the home until Shauna returned from work, then kill her in a way that would look like a robbery gone wrong. On the morning of September 29, 2012, George was scheduled to work a 24-hour shift at the fire station. This would provide him with a perfect alibi for the time of Shauna's murder. Before leaving for work, he made sure that their 8-year-old daughter Maddie was safely with her grandparents, where she would spend the night. Everything was arranged. George would be at work. surrounded by colleagues who could vouch for his whereabouts. Maddie would be safe with family. Stevens would be waiting in the townhouse with a claw hammer that George had provided specifically for the purpose. Shauna finished her shift at the Palms Casino that evening. Unaware that these would be her final hours of life, she drove home to her quiet townhouse, perhaps thinking about her plans for the following day, perhaps looking forward to seeing Maddie, perhaps simply tired from another long day of work. When she entered her home, Stevens was waiting. What happened next was brutal beyond imagination. Using the claw hammer that George had given him, Stevens attacked Shauna with a ferocity that spoke to the desperation of his situation and the evil of the plan he was carrying out. The medical examiner would later determine that Shauna had been struck 17 times with both ends of the hammer. The attack was so severe that she was beaten beyond recognition. The woman whose laugh had once filled rooms, whose presence had brought joy to so many lives, was brutalized in the sanctuary of her own home. After the murder, Stevens fled the scene, taking with him some of Shauna's jewelry to make the crime appear to be a robbery. The townhouse fell silent, and Shauna's body remained undiscovered as the night wore on. The next morning, George's shift at the fire station ended. According to the plan he had devised, he was to return to Shauna's house with Maddie, ostensibly for a routine custody exchange. The idea was that he and his daughter would discover Shauna's body together, making George appear to be just another victim of the terrible crime. The cold calculation involved in this plan reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of George's character. He was prepared to traumatize his own 8-year-old daughter, to have her witness her mother's brutalized body in order to maintain his alibi and avoid suspicion. And so it was that on the morning of September 30th, George Tyaf walked into Shauna's townhouse with little Maddie by his side, knowing exactly what they would find but pretending to be shocked by the discovery. His performance as the grieving husband began in that moment, as he called 911 and tried to shield his daughter from the horrific scene. The responding officers found Shauna's body in the living room of her townhouse. The violence of the attack was immediately apparent, and it was clear that this was no simple robbery. The severity of her injuries suggested a level of rage and brutality that indicated this was likely a personal crime. George's behavior at the scene was observed carefully by the responding officers. While he appeared distraught, there were subtle inconsistencies in his demeanor that raised question. Some officers noted that his grief seemed performative, that his reactions didn't quite match what they would expect from someone who had just discovered their spouse's murdered body. The investigation began immediately. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, looking for witnesses and evidence. They examined the townhouse for clues, processed the crime scene for forensic evidence, and began building a timeline of Shauna's final day. Early in the investigation, George was questioned as the victim's estranged husband. He provided his alibi. He had been at work at the fire station all night, surrounded by colleagues who could verify his presence. He seemed to be genuinely grieving the loss of his wife, and his alibi appeared to be airtight. But as detectives dug deeper into the case, inconsistencies began to emerge. They learned about the couple's troubled marriage, the recent separation, and the financial pressures that a divorce would bring for George. They discovered the break-in that had occurred at Shauna's home weeks before her murder, and they began to see patterns that suggested this was not a random crime. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Noel Stevens, the homeless man who had carried out the actual murder, was not equipped to handle the psychological pressure of what he had done. Within days of the crime, he began drinking heavily and talking about the murder to other homeless individuals in the community. Word of Stevenson's involvement eventually reached the police through tips from people who had heard his drunken confessions. When detectives located and questioned Stevens, his story quickly fell apart under questioning. Faced with evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Stevens decided to cooperate with investigators. Stevens' confession revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. He detailed how George had gradually manipulated him into carrying out the murder, providing him with access to the home, weapons, and detailed instructions. He described how George had painted Shauna as the villain in their relationship and how he had been promised payment for his services. The payment, investigators learned, was a mere $600. Shauna's life had been ended for an amount that wouldn't cover most people's monthly car payment. As the investigation continued, more evidence of George's guilt emerged. Phone records showed communications between George and Stevens in the weeks leading up to the murder. Financial records revealed the payments George had made to Stevens for various jobs. The timeline of George's activities showed that he had ample opportunity to plan and coordinate the attack. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that George had provided Stevens with the murder weapon, the claw hammer that had been used to kill Shauna. This was not a weapon of opportunity or convenience. It was a tool specifically chosen for its lethality and provided by a husband to kill his wife. George maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, insisting that he had been at work during the time of the murder, and that he had no involvement in Shauna's death, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and in 2013 he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. The trial, when it finally began, was a media sensation in Las Vegas. The story had all the elements that capture public attention. A beautiful victim, a husband with a secret dark side, and a murder-for-hire plot that seemed to come from the pages of a crime novel. Prosecutors painted George as a controlling, manipulative man who could not accept his wife's decision to leave him. They argued that he had seen murder as the solution to his problems. It would eliminate the need for a costly divorce, allow him to keep his assets, and remove the woman who had defied his control. The defense team tried to argue that while Stevens had indeed killed Shauna, George had not been involved in the planning or execution of the crime. They suggested that Stevens had acted on his own, perhaps in an attempt to rob Shauna, and that his claims of being hired by George were fabricated, but the evidence was too strong to overcome. Stevens' testimony was detailed and consistent, matching with physical evidence and timeline analyses. The financial records showed a clear pattern of payments from George to Stevens. Phone records documented their communications leading up to the murder. Perhaps most compelling was the evidence of George's behavior in the days and weeks following Shauna's death. Rather than appearing to be a man devastated by the loss of his wife, George had quickly moved to secure control of their shared assets and had shown relatively little emotion at her funeral. The trial also revealed the full extent of the emotional abuse that Shauna had endured during their marriage. Friends and family members testified about the changes they had observed in her personality over the years, describing how her natural joy and confidence had been gradually eroded by George's controlling behavior. In September of 2015, after deliberating for 15 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. George Tyaf was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and several other related charges. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on whether George should receive the death penalty or life in prison. Prosecutors argued that the premeditated nature of the crime, the involvement of George's young daughter in discovering the body, and the overall cruelty of the plot warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense presented mitigation evidence, trying to show that George had positive qualities and that there were reasons to spare his life. They pointed to his career as a firefighter, his service to the community, and his role as a father. Ultimately, the jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. In December of 2015, George Tyaf was formally sentenced to life imprisonment. He would never again walk free. Noel Stevens, who had cooperated with investigators and testified against George, received a sentence of 42 years to life in prison. While his cooperation was noted by the court, the brutal nature of the crime and his direct role in Shauna's death ensured that he too would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The case concluded, but the impact of Shauna's death continues to ripple through the lives of those who loved her. Her sister Paula and brother-in-law John became advocates for domestic violence awareness, using their tragedy to help other women recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships. Young Maddie, now without both parents due to the actions of her father, was left to be raised by her extended family. The trauma of discovering her mother's body and learning the truth about her father's role in the murder represents a burden that no child should ever have to bear. The case of Shauna Tyaf serves as a stark reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to its ultimate conclusion. The signs were there: the controlling behavior, the emotional abuse, the manipulation, but they were subtle enough that even those close to the couple didn't fully recognize the danger. It also illustrates how men who appear to be pillars of the community can harbor the darkest of intentions. George Tyaf was a firefighter, a man whose profession involved saving lives and helping others, yet he was capable of orchestrating the brutal murder of the mother of his child. The story reveals the vulnerability of those who exist on the margins of society. Noel Stevens, homeless and struggling with addiction, was an easy target for George's manipulation. His desperation made him susceptible to being used as a weapon in George's war against his wife. Perhaps most tragically, the case shows how a man's inability to accept rejection can lead to the ultimate act of control: murder. When Shauna found the strength to leave her abusive marriage, she unknowingly signed her own death warrant. George could not accept that she had escaped his dominance, and he chose to destroy her rather than let her live free. Today, George Tyaf sits in a Nevada prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. In a moment of conscience that came far too late, he eventually confessed to his crime in 2017, finally acknowledging his role in orchestrating Shauna's murder. But no confession can bring back the vibrant, loving woman whose life was cut short by his jealousy and rage. Shauna's family held a closed-casket funeral for her, as the violence of her death had left her too badly injured for an open service. The woman who had brought so much joy and laughter into the world was remembered not as she was found, but as she had lived, full of warmth, love, and an infectious happiness that touched everyone around her. The case stands as a testament to the work of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the prosecutors who ensured that justice was served for Shauna. Their thorough investigation and careful prosecution meant that her killer and the man who orchestrated her death would be held accountable for their crimes. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of domestic abuse and supporting those who find themselves trapped in controlling relationships. Shauna's story might have ended differently if the subtle signs of George's abusive behavior had been recognized and addressed earlier. In the end, the murder of Shauna Tyaf is a story about love perverted into possession, about a man who believed that if he couldn't have complete control over his wife, then no one could have her at all. It's a reminder that the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is often when she tries to leave. But it's also a story about a woman who found the courage to walk away from abuse, who tried to build a new life for herself and her daughter, and whose memory continues to inspire others to recognize that no one deserves to be controlled, manipulated, or harmed by someone who claims to love them. Shauna Tyaf's laughter was silenced on September 29, 2012, but the impact of her life and the lessons of her death continue to resonate. In remembering her story, we honor not just her memory, but the memories of all those who have lost their lives to domestic violence. And we commit ourselves to creating a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare. As Las Vegas continues to pulse with its neon energy, as the Palms Casino serves drinks to new customers who never knew the waitress who once worked there with such warmth and dedication, the story of Shauna Tyaf remains a sobering reminder that behind the glittering facade of any city, real people live, love, struggle, and sometimes die in ways that reveal both the worst and the best of human nature. The case is closed, justice has been served. The woman at the center of this tragedy, the mother, daughter, sister, and friend, whose only crime was trying to escape an abusive marriage, deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a person whose life had meaning, whose laugh brought joy to others, and whose story continues to matter long after the courtroom doors have closed and the headlines have faded. In the quiet of the night, as Las Vegas settles into whatever peace it can find between the chaos of its days, we remember Shauna Tyaf not for the way she died, but for the way she lived, and we hope that her story might somehow help prevent such tragedies from befalling others in the future. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we travel to the quiet suburbs of Dublin, Georgia, where beneath the surface of small-town life, a toxic relationship would spiral into a night of violence that would forever change multiple lives. This is the story of Daniel Raburn, a 39-year-old man whose tumultuous relationship with his fiancée would ultimately cost him everything. Daniel Raburn was a man trying to make his way in Dublin, a small city nestled in the heart of Georgia's Lawrence County. At 39, he had found what he thought might be lasting love with Brandilly Nicole Woodard Brady, a 37-year-old woman who would become both his fiancée and, tragically, the architect of his demise. Their relationship was far from the fairy tale that engagements are supposed to represent. Those who knew them described their bond as rocky and toxic, words that would later echo through courtrooms and police reports. Like many troubled relationships, theirs was marked by intense highs and devastating lows. Arguments that erupted without warning, and a pattern of behavior that friends and family had grown to recognize as dangerous. Brenda Lee, known to those close to her as someone who could quickly shift from charm to rage, had a network of acquaintances that included men willing to do her bidding. Among these was Andrew Thomas Huber, 37, a man whose loyalty to Brenda Lee would prove both unwavering and deadly. There was also Thomas Wayne Harper, 27, another piece in what would become a carefully orchestrated plan of violence. The summer of 2020 had been particularly tense for Daniel and Brenda Lee. Their arguments had grown more frequent, more intense. Neighbors had grown accustomed to raised voices carrying across the night air from their home on Village Circle. But July 3rd, 2020 would be different. This wouldn't be just another argument that ended with slammed doors and temporary separations. This would be the night that words became weapons, and weapons became instruments of murder. The afternoon of July 3rd began like many others in their household. The tension between Daniel and Brenda Lee had been building for days, perhaps weeks. Small disagreements had accumulated like kindling, waiting for the spark that would ignite them into something far more dangerous. As evening approached, that spark came in the form of another argument. The exact details of what triggered this particular fight have been lost to time and selective memory, but what followed was documented in text messages, witness statements, and ultimately in a man's blood on the ground. Brenda Lee, in her anger, reached for her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she composed a message to Andrew Huber, a message that would later be read aloud in a courtroom, each word carrying the weight of premeditated violence. "Beat his ass," she typed, referring to Daniel. Those three simple words would set in motion a chain of events that would end in murder. Huber received the message and understood its meaning immediately. This wasn't a metaphorical request or an emotional outburst. This was a direct instruction from a woman he was willing to do anything for. He gathered Thomas Harper, and together they prepared to answer Brenda Lee's call. The plan was simple in its brutality. They would go to Daniel's home, confront him, and deliver the beating that Brenda Lee had requested. What none of them anticipated, or perhaps what they simply didn't care to consider, was how far the violence would escalate once it began. As darkness settled over Village Circle, Daniel Raburn had no idea that his fiancée had summoned two men to his home with instructions to harm him. He was simply existing in what had become the uncomfortable normalcy of his relationship with Brenda Lee, the constant undercurrent of tension that had become their daily reality. When Huber and Harper arrived at the residence, they found Daniel in his yard. What happened next would be reconstructed later through witness testimony, physical evidence, and the admissions of the perpetrators themselves. The confrontation began with words, but quickly escalated into physical violence. Harper, who is black, later testified that Daniel used a racial slur when he saw him, referring to him with the N-word and demanding he leave his yard. This verbal assault ignited Harper's anger, transforming what might have been a simple beating into something far more deadly. The racial element added another layer of rage to an already volatile situation. The two men attacked Daniel with brutal efficiency. They beat him severely, their fists and possibly other weapons leaving bruises across his body. Daniel, outnumbered and caught off guard, fought back as best he could, but he was overwhelmed by the coordinated assault. As the violence escalated, someone produced a gun. The exact sequence of events became a matter of legal debate, but the outcome was undeniable. A shot rang out in the quiet suburban night. The bullet struck Daniel in the back of his head, dropping him instantly to the ground. The man who had been fighting for his life moments before was now fighting for something more basic, his next breath. But that breath never came. Daniel Raburn died there in his own yard, his blood soaking into the Georgia soil while his killer stood over his body. The man who had simply been trying to live his life despite the toxicity that surrounded him was dead at the age of 39. Hours passed before Daniel's body was discovered. The summer heat of Georgia made the passage of time evident on his remains. When someone finally spotted the motionless figure in the yard of the Village Circle home and called police, the scene that greeted first responders was one of unmistakable violence. It was approximately 7:30 p.m. on Saturday evening when the call came in. A concerned citizen had noticed a man lying motionless in the yard and contacted authorities. Dublin police officers arrived to find Daniel Raburn's body in a state that left no doubt about the violent nature of his death. The gunshot wound to the back of his head was immediately apparent, but it wasn't the only evidence of the brutal attack he had endured. His body bore multiple bruises, testimony to the beating he had received before the fatal shot. The stiffness of his remains indicated he had been dead for several hours, likely since the early morning hours. Insects had already begun their grim work, adding another layer of horror to an already tragic scene. Police Chief Tim Chapman, who would become the public face of the investigation, quickly determined that this was no accident, no suicide, no natural death. This was a homicide, and a particularly brutal one at that. The investigation began immediately, but the perpetrators had already set in motion their attempts to cover their tracks. Dublin police worked methodically to unravel the events that had led to Daniel Raburn's death. Their first breakthrough came through an examination of the relationship between the victim and those closest to him. It didn't take long for investigators to focus their attention on Brenda Woodard Brady. The couple's troubled relationship was well known to neighbors and friends. Their arguments were frequent and loud enough that others had taken notice. When investigators began interviewing those who knew the couple, a picture emerged of a relationship marked by volatility, and crucially of Brandeley's connections to other men who might be willing to act on her behalf. The text message Brandeley had sent to Andrew Huber became a crucial piece of evidence. "Beat his ass," she had written, and investigators now had documentary proof that she had actively solicited violence against her fiancé. This wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. This was a calculated decision to involve others in harming Daniel. As the investigation deepened, the names Andrew Thomas Huber and Thomas Wayne Harper surfaced repeatedly. Witnesses placed them in the area around the time of the murder. Their own admissions, made during questioning, provided additional pieces of the puzzle. Slowly but surely, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The evidence painted a picture of three people working in concert to harm Daniel Raburn, with Brandy as the instigator, Huber as the eager accomplice, and Harper as the ultimately deadly participant. Each played a crucial role in the events that led to Daniel's death, and each would face the full weight of the law as a result. On Monday, July 6, 2020, just 3 days after Daniel Raburn's body was discovered, Dublin police made their first arrest. Brandely Nicole Woodard Brady was charged with first-degree murder in her fiancé's death. The woman who had shared his home, his bed, and his plans for the future was now accused of orchestrating his death. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. While domestic violence was unfortunately not uncommon, the calculated nature of this particular crime, a woman enlisting others to kill her partner, struck many as particularly cold-blooded. Brandeley's mugshot, when it was released, showed a woman who appeared almost defiant, as if she felt no remorse for her role in the tragedy. But Brandeley was not the only one who would face charges. On Tuesday, July 7th, Andrew Thomas Huber was arrested and charged with murder. The 37-year-old man who had responded to Brandeley's text message with such deadly efficiency now found himself facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The following day, Wednesday, July 8th, Thomas Wayne Harper was also arrested and charged with murder. The 27-year-old who had actually pulled the trigger that ended Daniel Raburn's life was now in custody, completing the trio of defendants who would face trial for their roles in the killing. Police Chief Tim Chapman addressed the media, explaining that their investigation had revealed a domestic dispute that escalated into murder. Daniel had been both beaten and shot, and the evidence clearly indicated that multiple people had participated in his death. The arrests were the result of thorough police work, but they were only the beginning of a legal process that would stretch on for years. The legal system moved methodically to process the three defendants, each of whom faced serious charges related to Daniel Raburn's death. The prosecution would need to prove not only that each defendant participated in the killing, but also that their actions met the legal standards for the charges they faced. Thomas Wayne Harper, as the person who actually fired the fatal shot, faced the most straightforward case from a prosecution standpoint. His role in Daniel's death was direct and undeniable. During the legal proceedings, Harper would eventually be convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a conviction that acknowledged his role in the killing, while also recognizing the circumstances that led to the fatal confrontation. Harper's defense team likely argued that the racial slur used by Daniel had provoked their client beyond reason, transforming what was intended to be an assault into a deadly encounter. While this didn't excuse the killing, it provided context that the jury apparently considered when reaching their verdict. Brandely Woodard Brady faced charges as the orchestrator of the violence. Her text message to Huber served as powerful evidence of her intent to have Daniel harmed. The prosecution argued that by soliciting the attack on her fiancé, she bore responsibility for his death, even though she didn't physically participate in the killing. The case against Andrew Thomas Huber proved to be the most complex from a legal standpoint. Huber had responded to Brandely's request, and had participated in the attack on Daniel, but he had not been the one to pull the trigger. The prosecution charged him with felony murder predicated on aggravated assault, arguing that his participation in the violent assault that led to Daniel's death made him legally responsible for the killing. Andrew Huber's trial became the most closely watched of the three cases, largely because it raised complex questions about criminal responsibility and the doctrine of felony murder. The prosecution argued that Huber's participation in the assault on Daniel Raburn made him legally responsible for Daniel's death, even though he hadn't fired the fatal shot. The evidence presented during the trial painted a clear picture of Huber's role in the events of July 3, 2020. The text message from Brenda Delgado requesting that he beat Daniel's ass established the premeditated nature of the attack. Witness testimony and physical evidence demonstrated that Huber had indeed participated in the violent assault on Daniel. The defense attempted to argue that Huber's actions didn't rise to the level of felony murder, suggesting that the evidence was insufficient to support such a serious conviction. They contended that Huber's participation in the assault, while criminal, shouldn't make him responsible for Harper's decision to use deadly force. However, the prosecution successfully argued that under Georgia's felony murder statute, anyone who participates in the commission of a felony that results in someone's death can be held responsible for that death, regardless of whether they personally delivered the fatal blow. The jury agreed, finding Huber guilty of felony murder predicated on aggravated assault. The conviction carried a sentence of life in prison, meaning that Huber would spend the rest of his life behind bars for his role in Daniel Raburn's death. For a man who had simply responded to a text message from a woman he cared about, the consequences proved to be devastating and permanent. Unwilling to accept his life sentence, Andrew Huber pursued an appeal of his conviction through the Georgia court system. His legal team raised several arguments in an attempt to overturn the jury's verdicts, including claims that the evidence was insufficient to support his felony murder conviction, and that his trial counsel had provided ineffective assistance. The case made its way through the appellate courts, ultimately reaching the Supreme Court of Georgia. Huber's attorneys argued that his participation in the assault on Daniel Raburn, while criminal, did not justify a felony murder conviction. They contended that the evidence, when viewed objectively, was insufficient to support such a serious finding. The defense also raised issues related to the effectiveness of Huber's trial counsel, suggesting that his attorney had failed to provide adequate representation during the original trial. These claims of ineffective assistance of counsel are common in serious criminal cases, as defendants seek to identify any possible grounds for overturning their convictions. However, the Georgia Supreme Court was not persuaded by these arguments. In their review of the case, the justices examined the evidence presented at trial and concluded that it was sufficient to support the jury's verdict, when viewed in the light most favorable to the prosecution, the standard used in evaluating the sufficiency of evidence in criminal cases. The court found that Huber's participation in the violent assault that led to Daniel Raburn's death was sufficient to support his conviction for felony murder, predicated on aggravated assault. The justices noted that under Georgia law, participants in violent felonies can be held responsible for deaths that occurred during the commission of those crimes, even if they don't personally cause the death. In 2024, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld Andrew Thomas Huber's murder conviction, ensuring that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life for his role in Daniel Raburn's death on July 3rd. The court's decision represented the final chapter in the legal proceedings related to this tragic case, at least as far as Huber was concerned. The appellate court's decision sent a clear message about criminal responsibility in cases involving multiple defendants. While Huber had not pulled the trigger that ended Daniel's life, his willingness to participate in the violent assault that led to the killing made him legally culpable for the death. The law recognized that criminal conspiracies create shared responsibility among all participants. Thomas Wayne Harper, who had actually fired the fatal shot, served his time for voluntary manslaughter. His conviction recognized both his role in causing Daniel's death and the provocative circumstances that led to the shooting, while he bore the most direct responsibility for the killing. His sentence was less severe than Huber's life sentence, reflecting the different legal theories under which they were prosecuted. The case of Brenda Woodard Brady, the woman whose text message had set the entire tragedy in motion, received less public attention in the aftermath of the trials. However, her role as the instigator of the violence that killed her fiancé was undeniable. She had solicited the attack on Daniel and bore significant moral, if not legal, responsibility for his death. Lost in the legal complexities and media coverage of the arrests and trials was the central tragedy of this case, the loss of Daniel Raburn's life. At 39, Daniel had years ahead of him. Relationships to nurture, dreams to pursue, contributions to make to his community and the world. All of that was stolen from him in a few moments of violence on a summer night in Georgia. Daniel's death serves as a stark reminder of how quickly domestic disputes can spiral into deadly violence. What began as another argument between two people in a troubled relationship escalated into a coordinated attack that left a man dead in his own yard. The progression from angry words to violent death happened with shocking speed. Those who knew Daniel described him as a man trying to navigate a difficult relationship, someone who may have been trapped in a cycle of toxicity that he couldn't find his way out of. Like many victims of domestic violence, he may have hoped that things would improve, that the woman he loved would change, that their problems could be resolved without outside intervention. The racial element that emerged during the confrontation adds another layer of tragedy to Daniel's death. The slur he used when he saw Harper was inexcusable and likely contributed to the escalation of violence. However, it's crucial to remember that words, no matter how offensive, never justify taking a life. Daniel's use of racist language was wrong, but it didn't warrant his death. The murder of Daniel Raburn offers several sobering lessons about domestic violence, criminal conspiracy, and the consequences of toxic relationships. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates how quickly situations can spiral beyond control when violence becomes an option for resolving disputes. Brenda decision to involve others in her conflict with Daniel transformed what might have been another argument into a deadly encounter. By texting Hubert to beat Daniel's ass, she escalated their domestic dispute into a criminal conspiracy. Her willingness to outsource violence to others showed a calculating coldness that ultimately cost her fiancé his life. The case also illustrates how criminal law handles situations involving multiple participants in violent crimes. While only Harper actually pulled the trigger, both Brenda and Hubert bore legal responsibility for Daniel's death because of their roles in instigating and participating in the assault. The law recognizes that criminal enterprises create shared culpability among all participants. For Andrew Huber, the case serves as a tragic example of how quickly one's life can be destroyed by poor decisions. His willingness to respond to Brenda request for violence led to a life sentence in prison. What may have seemed like a simple favor for someone he cared about became the defining moment of his life, consigning him to spend his remaining years behind bars. The racial aspect of the confrontation provides another important lesson. Daniel's use of a racial slur created additional anger and violence in an already volatile situation. While his words didn't justify his killing, it contributed to the escalation that led to his death. The case serves as a reminder of how racist language can have deadly consequences, even when that's not the speaker's intent. July 3, 2020, began as just another summer day in Dublin, Georgia. By the time the sun rose on July 4th, a man was dead. 3 people faced murder charges and multiple families were forever changed by a few hours of violence. The small city that had been home to Daniel Raburn would be known, at least briefly, for the brutal murder that occurred in one of its residential neighborhoods. The house on Village Circle where Daniel died likely stands empty now, or has been occupied by new residents who may or may not know about the tragedy that occurred there. The yard where Daniel's body was found has been cleaned, the evidence collected, the scene processed and photographed and documented for posterity, but the memory of what happened there remains. Brenda Woodard Brady lives with the knowledge that her words set in motion the events that killed the man she had planned to marry. Whether she feels remorse for her role in Daniel's death is known only to her, but she bears the responsibility for transforming a domestic dispute into a murder plot. Thomas Wayne Harper, the man who pulled the trigger, has served his time for voluntary manslaughter. He carries with him the knowledge that he took a life in a moment of rage, that his response to Daniel's racial slur escalated a bad situation into a deadly one. The words that provoked him were inexcusable, but his response was irreversible. Andrew Thomas Huber will spend the rest of his life in a Georgia prison, his freedom sacrificed for his willingness to answer Brenda call for violence. He learned too late that some requests should never be honored, that some favors carry consequences that last a lifetime. His loyalty to a woman cost him everything, and Daniel Raburn lies buried somewhere in Georgia soil, his life cut short by people who claimed to care about him but proved willing to destroy him. He will never see another sunrise, never have the chance to escape the toxic relationship that killed him, never have the opportunity to find the peace and happiness that eluded him in his final years. This case reminds us that domestic violence doesn't always fit neat patterns, that sometimes the victim and the perpetrator can seem to switch roles in a single moment, that violence has a way of escalating beyond anyone's ability to control it. It shows us how quickly a text message can become a murder weapon, how easily loyalty can become complicity, how rapidly a troubled relationship can become a criminal conspiracy. The murder of Daniel Raburn is a story of choices and consequences, of words that led to actions that led to death. It's a reminder that we all have the power to escalate or de-escalate conflicts, to choose violence or choose peace, to solve our problems through conversation or through force. Daniel Raburn paid the ultimate price for the choices made by others, but his death serves as a warning to all of us about the deadly potential that exists when love turns to hate, when words become weapons, and when violence becomes the answer to relationship problems. In the end, this isn't just a story about a murder in small-town Georgia. It's a story about all of us, about the relationships we navigate, the conflicts we face, and the choices we make when we're angry, hurt, or desperate. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences, that our words matter, and that sometimes the price of violence is higher than anyone imagined it would be. Daniel Raburn deserved better than the death he received. He deserved the chance to escape his toxic relationship, to find peace, to live out his natural life surrounded by people who truly loved him. Instead, he became another victim of domestic violence, another casualty of the human capacity for cruelty, another reminder that we must do better in how we treat each other. His story ends here, but the lessons it teaches should live on, in a world where violence too often seems like an easy answer to complex problems. The murder of Daniel Raburn shows us the true cost of choosing force over understanding, revenge over resolution, hatred over healing. May his memory serve as a reminder that there are always alternatives to violence, always other ways to handle our conflicts, always better choices we can make than the ones that led to his death on that summer night in Georgia. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.